Um, Welcome to a celebration that I've wanted to have for quite a while. Celebrating Joe Farry and the professorship that's been created in his name, thanks to a generous gift from Dan Whalen, and that operates through the McCarthy Center for Civic Engagement and Public Policy. What I'm going to do tonight is try to give you a sense of what this position is all about, what we can do with it as an institution, and then the fun part, I think, is going to be that Gary Eichten, illustrious alum of St. John's University, and Joe and I are going to sit down and have a conversation about whatever we want to talk about, but probably related to some of the things I bring up here, some of Joe Farry's career and things that have happened in St. John's while he was here, and in a sense, anything the audience wants to talk about as well. We can take some questions and things like that. So let me just start out. I've got a slide up here that says rivers, roads, and tracks transforming Minnesota's economy. I'm going to talk about that some, but let me start out with some words of wisdom. I have to admit I'm nervous tonight. I've got what some people would call the butterflies. And one of my favorite singers in all the world is Tony Bennett. And Tony Bennett said that if you don't have the butterflies, you don't care. So I'm taking the attitude that it must be because I really care about this a lot. And to help me with the butterflies, especially over the last year or so since I heard these words of wisdom, I've tried to keep these words of wisdom in mind from Lorne Michaels of Saturday Night Live.
Amen.
You're just never going to get it right. How's that? I thought it was on. Sorry about that. So, see, I should have had you doing this, Gary. You know when the light's on and stuff like that. So, you know, I could have worked on this presentation and these ideas for months and months and hours and days, and I realized, look, it's just got to be done tonight. So I'm going to share this with a group of friends. What is the Farry Professorship? Well, let me give you the boilerplate or the description that was given to me when I first applied for it. And I always tell my students, a few of them are here in my first year seminar class, never read off your slides. It's gauche. Well, I'm going to read off my slide right off the bat. The Farry Professorship is designed to allow a faculty member to undertake scholarship related to civic engagement, public affairs, and/or public policy, to explore what it means to be a public intellectual, to model ways of bringing scholarship to bear on significant issues of public policy, and to plan and implement related programming. There's a really important word here, scholarship. It's one of the things that I think sets College of St. Benedict and St. John's University apart. If you go to most colleges and universities and you read their faculty handbook, they'll have a section about the requirements that you're supposed to meet for teaching, the requirements you're supposed to meet for service to the institution and the community, and then they'll have a section on research. That's not what it says in our handbook. It says scholarship. We're not just about the traditional publish things in academic journals. That's great. That's a really important part of scholarship. But scholarship also involves making connections between what's in those academic journals and what's going on out in the real world, of bringing what's way up here in the Ivory Tower down to Main Street, is the way I like to characterize it. So that's part of what the Farry Professorship is all about, is making those connections. Now, one word that is sometimes, one phrase that's made me a bit uncomfortable at times, is this phrase, public intellectual. Not quite sure what that means, and so for the last year or so I've been kind of on a quest to think about what that phrase means. And so the first place I started was to ask the question, well, wait a second, what is a professor? I mean, you'd think I'd know after having been one for 24 years, but I'm still thinking about this question. And what I thought first was, well, what do people in general think of a professor? When they hear the word professor, what do they think of? And I realized what they usually think of is this guy. Now, if you're culturally literate, you will recognize who this is. This is the professor from Gilligan's Island. There's often a view of professors that we are like the character from Gilligan's Island. I mean, if you're a professor, you can make cool gadgets, you know, you can even turn Shakespeare's Hamlet into a musical, right? For those of you who are old enough to remember that episode. It's one of the best episodes of all time, by the way. If you ever want to see Hamlet done the way it should have been done, watch Gilligan's Island. It's the best way. So that's kind of the view of what professors are. We can do everything. We can teach Shakespeare, we can teach physics, we can build stuff. That's not really what professors are like. We tend to be very specialized. The way I phrase it is, we know stuff. We know a lot about certain things. And what I, supposedly, colleagues seem to agree, that I know at least a little bit about is economics. That's my area. So let me use that as a jumping off point to that other question then of what is a public intellectual? What does it mean to be a public intellectual? And in order to understand that, let me contrast a public intellectual with a word that I think you hear a lot more often, pundit. What's the difference between a public intellectual and a pundit? Well, let me give you some words and then I'll show you a couple of pictures. A public intellectual, to me, is someone who connects scholarly insight with real-world problems and who does it by grounding his or her contributions in their own scholarly work. So you're connecting what's going on with the real world with things that you've thought deeply about and done research on. A pundit is someone who reads widely, perhaps even deeply, but they don't carry out original research. They haven't created anything of their own. They're basically gathering together bits and pieces from other people, fashioning them into something that might be interesting and useful, but that's what they're doing. They're not doing research. They're not taking what's cutting edge and current and bringing that to bear. So let me give you a concrete example. Here's a public intellectual. Now, whether you like Paul Krugman or not, or whether you agree with him or not, he's a Nobel Prize-winning economist who bases most of what he talks about on the fact that he's been studying economics at the graduate level and as a professor since the mid-1970s. That's where he comes from on this. It isn't just from his casual reading of things. Now, on the other side of the New York Times is this guy. I don't know if you recognize him, David Brooks. I would classify him as a pundit. He's a smart person. He's intelligent. He reads widely, maybe even deeply in certain subjects. If you read his books like The Social Animal or Bobo's in Paradise, he's clearly read a lot and synthesized it. But he hasn't done that deep research. He hasn't done that scholarship that a public intellectual is supposed to do, that I would argue a public intellectual must do in order to have that title. So, let me just point out that I would argue that Joe Farry is a public intellectual. I was making a joke to Joe before dinner tonight that everywhere I go, he already seems to have been there. I went to give a talk at the Whitney Senior Center in January, and the people said, oh yeah, well, Joe's going to be giving a talk, and he gave one in the fall, and you know, it's really nice to have you, because I mean, we already saw Joe. And I went out to Alexandria to give a talk at the senior college out there, and they said, oh yeah, we really wanted to have you because Joe said you'd be really good. Not because, you know, whether I was or not, Joe said so. Seriously, I really do want to emphasize that Joe's still using his scholarship to be involved in public policy. I mean, for example, the CapEx 2020 power line and all of that. A power line going from way up in North Dakota across all of Minnesota. He was intimately involved in dealing with where should that be sited, where should that be routed, partly because it was right by your house, of course, but it wasn't just a pundit's view of what was going on. There was a deep knowledge of what the situation was and of thinking about what the history of the area was. And to me, that's the epitome of what a public intellectual is. So one of the things that I want to make sure and say a number of times tonight is how honored I am to have a professorship named after you. That I think that's just something that's really important to me. So thank you very much for letting us put your name on this professorship. This brings me to the topic. Rivers and roads and tracks. And I chose this topic for a couple of reasons. First of all, I chose it because Joe Farry and Jill, where's Jill? There's Jill. Yay! They live right by where the railroad tracks used to be that connect this area with the rest of the world. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Also, one of the first things, you may not remember this, but when I came in the fall of 1997, I had a one-year appointment, and you were one of the people who was actually paid attention to me, who actually was nice to me. And one of the things we hit it off over was railroads. We started talking about the Great Northern and the fact that it went right by here. So I thought, what an appropriate thing. Let's do that as a topic for tonight. So what I want to do is I want to show you some maps. I want to show you some pictures and tell you a story about how Minnesota's economy has evolved, and then use that to think about some current public policy problems. Now, I am not a geographer. I did my best to find maps that would work, but if there are any students who want to work with me as a research assistant and who know how to do mapping stuff, let's talk, because I could sure use some help in this. For example, here's a beautiful map. This is actually from the state of Minnesota. They have a mapping tool that allows you to map anything you want for the state of Minnesota in terms of major features. So, be a little interactive here. What is this a map of, do you think? What are the things that are on there? Good guess, given my title. Those are the major river systems in Minnesota. Well, if you're going to understand how Minnesota's economy has evolved from, say, 1820 onward, before that if you want, but that's kind of where my specialty starts, you've got to start with the rivers. In particular, people came to Minnesota from Europe and started creating a European-style economy as opposed to what was here when native peoples were the only ones walking the earth in this area. They did it in two ways. One was by coming up the Mississippi and encountering this system here where the Mississippi and the Minnesota rivers converge. What's now Fort Snelling, and of course the Minneapolis-St. Paul Airport. One of the most amazing things, I think, to have an airport at the place where everything started in Minnesota. Coming up here, and then sometimes it's forgotten, also coming this direction. The French voyageurs making their way from, I'll point way over here, Montreal, right? It's Montreal's over there. Coming all the way over here, working their way across what's now Canada, now Ontario, working their way and ending up where my dad grew up here in Warroad, Minnesota. But notice there's not just these systems where Europeans and later Americans came. The Mississippi continues on up this way to Itasca, where my wife and son and daughter like to spend a week every summer. The Minnesota, coming this way. And then, even though it's not on this map very clearly because it's the border, the Red River. This area right up here, which then, of course, continues on into Canada up to Lake Winnipeg. So early on, starting in the 1820s and 1830s, there was an economy that connected this area down here in southeastern Minnesota, and in particular the area around what's now Minneapolis-St. Paul, Stillwater, down into the area that's now Rochester and Winona, with the Red River Valley. How did that happen? Well, that's the second thing in my title, roads. Now, I use the word roads guardedly. It's the term that people use to describe these. Really, a lot of them were just ruts. Basically, two ruts that had been dug into the ground by wagons and other forms of transportation, basically pushing their way through the woods or across the prairie. But I did this on purpose because, let me go back, there's the rivers. Take a snapshot in your mind. Now look at the roads. Right, here's the road system coming up here along the Mississippi and then down along the Minnesota. Here's another one that keeps going up along the Mississippi, all the way up here. Here's another one that connects the Red River here with this river system down here. There's roads coming up here towards what's now Duluth. The roads didn't just show up independently. People didn't just say, where would be the best place to put the roads? They built the roads where commerce already was taking place, along the river systems and along the lakes that the native peoples and then the first Europeans and Americans had set out as routes of commerce. Now think about this a little bit. You've got a lot of commercial stuff going on down here. One nice route is to be able to take some of the things that you've been bringing up the Mississippi here and ship them up the Red River to Winnipeg. But, you know, this is kind of a pain in here. You guys probably haven't done this. I know I haven't. You ever tried to walk from roughly St. Cloud to what's now Fargo or Grand Forks? That's a long walk. They used to do that using a transportation technology called Red River carts. They were pulled by oxen, but the people walked. You used the oxen to pull the carts and haul the goods. Well, there was a lot of money to be made, it turned out, doing this. And there's a guy who came to St. Paul in the 1850s who saw a really nice profit opportunity if you could somehow connect what was going on in terms of commerce up here with what was going on in terms of commerce down here. I don't know if any of you recognize this guy. I know somebody who probably recognizes him. James J. Hill. This is James J. Hill when he was 35 years old. He had come to St. Paul and set up a warehouse on the levee. And his warehouse was unique. He set up his warehouse in a way that you could move goods and move goods, maybe services too, but goods, from steamboats that were coming up the Mississippi River onto the levee, directly onto the Red River carts. And so what Hill came up with at first was, go back to this picture here, I'll unload freight here in St. Paul, put it on these carts, and then I'll help manage the running of these carts all the way up here to the river. And his first innovation was, hey, I'm getting the goods by steamboats down here. What if I put a steamboat up here? I wouldn't have to rely on these canoes and rowboats and these other kinds of watercraft that people are using to haul stuff. If I were able to put a steamboat up here, that would work pretty well. So he teamed up with a guy whose name you might know if you've lived in his county, Norman Kittson, Kittson County. Made a deal with Kittson. Kittson would run the steamboat operation up there. Hill would make sure that the goods came from Minneapolis, St. Anthony and St. Paul, up to here, and he would haul them up to Winnipeg. Made Hill a pretty tidy sum between the late 1850s and the late 1860s. Became one of the richest men in St. Paul. Built himself a very nice house in what's now Lower Town. Got married, started having a family. But Hill was aware of other kinds of technologies that were starting to come on the scene in the 1840s and 1850s. The railroad. Now, a lot of us kind of have it mashed together in our heads when the railroad was invented and when it was coming to different parts of the United States. So let me just give you a quick capsule history. If you think about the railroad in the United States, there's basically two periods to think about. One is the period before the Civil War, roughly from 1840 to 1860. You can think of that as the period when the railroads went from New England out to the Mississippi. So basically that area above the Ohio River, east of the Mississippi, and west of New England. That whole area filled up with railroads. Minnesota's, think about that, is kind of on the edge. It's kind of on the periphery out there. It's not really part of all of that. That's where Hill comes in. He realizes we could take advantage of this technology in Minnesota, and we could maybe start using rails to make these connections instead of using ox carts and walking and all the other ways that you can move from one place to another. So I'm going to use a contemporary map because I couldn't get any of the old ones to show up very well, and I want you guys to be able to see really well. What Hill does is he starts building two railroads, one up towards St. Cloud here, and one out west, this green line here, both with the goal of going up to the Red River Valley, both with connecting up there. And by 1878, he's got basically the best connection between the Twin Cities and the Red River Valley of any railroad in Minnesota. It's straighter, it's flatter, he's got better rolling stock, meaning the cars and the locomotives, than any of his competitors. And so he basically becomes the transportation link between the Red River Valley and Minneapolis-St. Paul. But take a look again. Do one of those mental snapshots that I asked you to do a few minutes ago. Take a look at this map. Take a look at that map. Take a look at that map. They sure look an awful lot alike. Again, they didn't just build the railroads across the state willy-nilly. They followed the paths that already existed. They followed the rivers. In fact, Hill thought this route was so good that he ended up building on both the south or west, whichever way you want to think of it, bank of the Mississippi, and the east. He built tracks on each side so that he can control the traffic on both sides of the river. He had to give up the East Bank track to the Northern Pacific later on, but it was a small price to pay. These roads followed the road routes as well, and in fact, other railroads came into the picture. This one listed here as CP, this red line here, that was actually the Canadians came in. They saw a good deal. They realized that this was pretty good, and they built a railroad as well to connect Minneapolis-St. Paul with the Red River Valley. They didn't call it a Canadian railroad, they called it the Sioux Line, but it actually was owned by the Canadian Pacific, partly owned by the Canadian government. So my point here is that if you think about Minnesota's economy from roughly the 1820s, 1830s, all the way up through, say, 1900, even 1920, you're basically talking about an organism that's working along the same routes. This route up the Mississippi, these routes down here in southeastern and southern Minnesota. The one thing that's a little bit different than all of this is, again, let me go back, take a look at these. Notice there's not a lot up here in terms of roads. And there's not a lot in terms of rivers. There are rivers, but these really aren't navigable. You can't put steamboats on them. So that was one of the big things that Hill did that didn't have to do with rivers or existing roads. He built railroads, up in this area here. And I probably don't have to tell you why, but I will anyway. The discovery of iron ore deposits. And in particular, the area we now call the Mesaba Iron Range in northern Minnesota. And one of the ironies of that situation was that when iron ore was first discovered on the Mesaba, he wasn't very excited about it. He didn't think there was much prospect of it. His son Louis had to convince him that this was worth doing. And he said, fine, if you think this is worth so much, here's some money and you go buy it. And as soon as they discovered that it was one of the biggest iron ore deposits, of course, James J. Hill bought it back from his son at a pretty good price. What happens in the 1920s, a little bit earlier, but starting in the 1920s, is the U.S. government, for all practical purposes, decides that there needs to be competition for this railroad network. And in particular, this railroad network that intertwines with rivers and with the existing roads. So starting in the 1920s, the U.S. government starts promoting an alternative technology for transportation. Cars, trucks, publicly financed highways. We're going to break the monopoly of the railroads, not by regulation, which they also use, but not so much by that, but by promoting an alternative, a different way of transporting goods and services. We're going to start building federally funded roads. Well, here's a map using, again, that same software from the state of Minnesota of federally funded roads in the state of Minnesota. These red ones here are the interstates. Well, look at this. Goes up there. Another one goes up there. Another one goes down here. There isn't, the only big difference is there's no one along the Minnesota River Valley this time. But there is, I was about to say, there is a federal highway that isn't an interstate. It's called US 169. And US 12 that goes out along the former Great Northern Route. My point, again, they didn't start with a clean sheet of paper. They followed the same tracks once again. All right, a lot of you have been my students. Too many probably tonight, you probably think. Let me give you some conclusions about this and then ask my favorite questions, which I'm bringing this up because I want you guys to think about what my favorite questions are. So what are the patterns of commerce that we get out of this? Well, first of all, the patterns of commerce that we see in Minnesota basically are set out by the rivers and the roads and the rails. And in particular, the patterns of commerce tend to stay roughly the same in terms of where goods are flowing and where people are moving. What's different is that over time, population centers develop at different nodes in the transportation network. And what's changing especially over time is that those nodes are different. So let me give you a little story about St. Joe and Collegeville. Think about when you came here tonight if you drove in. You came in off of Interstate 94 up that really terribly icy road. It was really slippery, and drove up to the Bell Banner. If you'd have made that drive 50 years ago, that's not the way you would have come into St. John's. You would have come at a 90-degree angle from that direction. Now, why did they change that? Well, part of it was Marcel Breuer, the architect. He wanted the Bell Banner to face that way. But the other big reason was the people who were building the interstate highway said, we're going to put the exit where it is now. We're not going to put it where the existing road comes into St. John's. So you're going to have to turn the campus 90 degrees in order to have an exit come off the freeway. The road system affected the way our campuses were oriented. Same thing's true if you go to St. Joe. It used to be oriented to the east because people would come from St. Cloud down what's now Minnesota Street. That was the main drag. Well, that's not true anymore. They come in off of 75. So the campus is turned, and off the freeway, so the campus is turned again, almost 90 degrees. My point is that the population centers in Minnesota have all done the same thing as well. If you go to almost every town in Minnesota, they have been turned one way or another as the different transportation modes have changed, from rivers to rails to roads. My other point is then to confront, as I said, my two favorite questions. Okay, so what? Who cares? You've told a maybe mildly interesting story. I'll let you guys be the judge of that. But so what? Here's why I think we need to care, and let me give you two reasons. Let's think about communications networks today. Right now, there is a gigantic battle going on for broadband in the United States. And if you have a chance to read books these days, if you're not stuck in writing a senior honors thesis or deep in your homework or whatever it is, may I suggest a book called Captive Audience, The Telecom Industry and Monopoly Power in the New Gilded Age. One of the best books I've read in a long time. The author, Susan Crawford, in chapter 1, tells a story. And when I read it, I was kind of blown away because she says, you know, if you look at the United States, patterns of commerce developed because of rivers and rails and roads. And as she points out there, and that those of us who study economic history know, and those of you who suffered through my American economic history class probably heard, when electricity lines started being strung, when telephone lines were strung, when telegraph lines were strung, they were strung on the exact same routes, the same places. And now the same thing is happening with regard to fiber optic cable. Fiber optic cable is being laid all over the United States, and primarily it's being laid along railroad rights-of-way and roads. And what Crawford points out is that we're in a very, she would call it dangerous, I would call it interesting, I'm an academic, situation where there's a threat to this. She argues that mergers like the one that's been announced between Comcast and Time Warner threaten to keep this from happening because the cable companies have no incentive to keep laying that fiber optic cable. They've got cable systems that already work just fine. What I think would be interesting to see would be, and here's where the so what comes in, could we do the same thing today in telecommunications policy that the United States government did 100 years ago and perhaps promote alternative technologies? For example, like Google Fiber. Could the United States government or some government agencies or some public-private partnership do the equivalent of a rural electrification for fiber? Or building the interstate highway system for fiber optics to connect towns and cities across the United States? Or something like that. I think we could. I think we should at least think about it. And right now I don't see the conversation happening. At least maybe I'm in the wrong place. Maybe I'm not at the right coffee shop to hear the conversation. But I think we need to have this conversation. Which brings me to my bigger point. What I want to do, and what I've been given the opportunity to do in the Farry Professorship, is to start thinking about issues like this and bring three things to bear. Over the next 2.5 years, I intend to use what I've at least tried to learn in terms of economic theory. As I get older, it starts to rust, and the younger faculty colleagues know a lot more of economic theory than I do. But to bring that to bear, along with what I know about economic history, to think about public policy. And to go the other way, to take issues that are going on in terms of public policy and say, wait a minute, that has connections with things we've seen in the past, with economic history. We can learn things between these two. And I already, over my career, have been doing this one, but I want to deepen this one of, wait a second, there are things we know from history that show that theory is wrong. Or things from theory that we know have to be driving what's going on in history. This one I think I'm going to leave probably to other people, but I'll do a little bit of that too. So, I've talked, I think, too much. That's up for you to decide. But what I want to do right now is make a transition by first giving some thank yous and then having a conversation with the three of us. First of all, I want to thank publicly and emphatically Matt Lindstrom. Is Stacy here? Stacy's not here. Stacy Pink and all the students at the McCarthy Center. You guys have been so welcoming this fall and now this spring. It's just an amazing place to work, and I'm so grateful to be able to come and hang out with you guys all the time. It's really fun for me, and I'm learning a lot, so thank you for the opportunity. Yes. Second, I wanted to thank President Michael Hemeseth for the opportunity to have this kind of a position at St. John's and also at St. Ben's, of course. Again, as I said at the beginning, it's a unique opportunity. I don't think there are very many schools where you get an opportunity like this to do this kind of work. And in particular, I want to thank Dan Whalen again for the opportunity. The resources to make this possible, I hope to put to very good use, and I appreciate it. I have 4, so here's 3. Third one is to my colleagues in the Department of Economics. My chair, Parker Wheatley, is here. I wanted to just say publicly, thank you for letting me do what I do, because it's kind of strange compared to what a lot of economists do. So thank you for being so tolerant. And last but absolutely not least, my family that puts up with a lot of the things that I end up doing and overcommitting to, and all the other projects that I take on. My daughter Olivia, who's not here tonight, she's down at the University of Minnesota. She's a first-year student. My son John, who is here and who maybe knows a little bit about what I do now. I don't know. We'll have to see. He's been coming here since he was literally 6 months old or so he knows this place pretty well. And absolutely my wife, Susan Riley, who's the best scholar that I actually know of. So thank you very much. So with that, let's have a little conversation. You're the star.
Yes, I still move.
Now, we're going to have an opportunity to take questions, so get your questions ready. I don't have a lot to ask these gentlemen. What can you say, you know? I'm out of my league here, so get your questions ready, and we'll get to those in just a couple of minutes. It is really a great honor to share a stage with two of my all-time favorites. Favorite economist, favorite professor here at St. John's. Pretend you didn't hear that, because there are some other people around who are pretty good too, but they're top-notch, top-notch. So, Lewis, what's the most pressing public policy issue facing central Minnesota right now that you're going to be working on?
That I'm going to be working on? Oh, okay. Well, I think there's both the most pressing and the one that I'm going to be working on. I don't know if they're going to be the same, but okay. To me, one of the most pressing ones is one of the things that I think is one of the most unsexy topics, but is one of the most important, which is what are we going to do about our wastewater and sewer infrastructure? Because it's crumbling in greater Minnesota right now. And we have to think of a way to make sure that that all gets repaired, because otherwise business and industry are going to flee greater Minnesota. They're not going to be able to do what they need to do. And so we need to make sure that the basic stuff of wastewater, of sewer, of electrical utilities, and that's why I brought up also the communications, the broadband technologies. If that stuff isn't there, companies like Columbia Gear are not going to stay, in places like Albany and Avon. Other companies are not going to relocate to St. Cloud because they won't have those resources. So what I'm going to be working on is not so much, I'm not going to be laying sewer pipe or doing anything like that, because I don't know what I'm doing, but what I want to do is get that conversation started and maybe push it along and say, look, it'd be fun to have a Super Bowl in Minneapolis, right? It would be fun to have a World's Fair maybe in Minnesota, but what we really need to be doing is fixing the sewers, fixing the water lines, building broadband, and doing the kinds of things that will make sure we have economic growth 20 and 30 years down the line.
And you see those as being at odds with each other?
Yeah, I do. I don't see how you can get the money to do all of that, at least at the level of taxation that people today are willing to pay.
Joe, what about that? We have heard a lot in the last few weeks about the severe shortage of money for transportation, just roads, bridges, maintenance here in Minnesota. Lewis points out we need to do something about the sewers. Is there anything that you can detect that looks like the political will to do any of that?
No. When you were talking about the 19th century, and my understanding of how the railroads came about, there's been a very seismic shift in our attitude toward the role of government in the economy. They actually had a much more open notion that the federal government was not the enemy. Federal government was the source of the money and the initiative to create the network. The state of Minnesota, while it was still a territory, the Congress gave it a land grant that the state of Minnesota then could use to create railroads.
Mm-hmm.
And that, when you take away land grant and say land was money, because they could translate that land into a mortgage, which was money. I'd buy a railroad bond because it was backed by land.
You could sell it.
I could sell it. So there was a credible gift to the state of Minnesota, not only from the railroads that Jim Hill was involved with, but even more the Northern Pacific. They got 20 sections of land either side. Minnesota was covered with railroad land grants. So my notion is that whole mindset has shifted. So when faced with a problem, no one was embarrassed to go to Washington and ask for help.
Were you here when the interstate was built?
Yes.
I mean, that's what I would think too, is that I can't imagine an interstate highway system being built today.
Right. Right.
The same kind of scale of saying, look, we need to do this. We need to put public resources towards it. It needs to be done because we are going to need these roads, not just tomorrow or next year, but for the next 50 years.
Right.
So is there an alternative to Uncle Sam here? Some way to finance these needed public projects without dipping into the public treasury?
Well, that's why I've been intrigued with this whole project of Google Fiber and projects like that, because it harkens back to the way a lot of the railroads were built, which was tapping into foreign capital. So, for example, if you look at a lot of the large railroads after the Civil War, they were built primarily with British money. And maybe there are a lot of Americans who wouldn't like it, but one way to build a fiber optic network might be to get the money from the Chinese. Tap the capital markets in China and do that. And borrow the money. They've got money to lend. We've got projects to build. Might be a beautiful relationship.
Joe, don't we end up as a hostage of these foreign powers?
Well, in the 19th century, they didn't think so. The railroad that runs just the other side of Collegeville was built by money from the Dutch bankers. Mm-hmm. And they got bamboozled by Americans. they bought the bonds, and they were worthless. And then Jim Hill said to them, well, you're sitting on worthless bonds. I'll tell you what, you give me one of your bonds, and I'll give you 2 bonds on a railroad that is yet to be built. And the Dutch were faced with 0 or 2 new pieces of paper. Mm-hmm. They took the 2 pieces of paper and did all right.
Did very well.
So the United States in the 19th century was not embarrassed to look to foreign sources. It was the only place we could go. We were a developing country. Now, it may be that we're so far along in that development now that option has got certain problems. I would think certainly borrowing money from the Chinese, although it is our money.
We're already doing it.
Yeah. There might be some political opposition to that. But you raised the question. It's a challenge. How are we going to get the resources, the capital, to push the new projects?
Now, Lewis, you were talking about scholarship, and you said one way to think about it is taking ideas from the Ivory Tower, putting them to work on Main Street. How big is that divide these days?
Well, I think it's pretty big. There was an article 2 weeks ago in the New York Times by Nicholas Kristof that had set off quite a furor out there. And there's been a number of different reactions, but one that's really surprised me is that there's been a reaction from what I'm calling the Ivory Tower saying, pardon my language, you're damn right it's an Ivory Tower and we're staying that way. Because that's what we're here for. And I worry a lot of times that we know things in colleges and universities that if we could get it out there, people would say, oh yeah, that's a really good idea. But we're either communicating it in a way that the general person can't understand, or we're framing it such that, and this is what used to drive you crazy sometimes on midday, we were so too often saying, well, on the one hand this, on the other hand that. And we don't really say, we don't just make a point and say, here's why this matters. So I think those are the two big problems, is we either are too complicated in the way we explain it, or we're too wishy-washy about how we put it.
How do you see that, Joe? I mean, you spent, what, 40 years, over 40 years here. Mm-hmm. Now you're a little bit removed. How wide is that divide?
I've had the opportunity the last couple of years to do some teaching at the Whitney Center, Senior Center in St. Cloud, and then up at Alexandria. And I was at Alexandria, it really struck me, there were 70 people in this class.
You went to Alexandria before Lewis, right?
I can't remember.
Yeah, you did.
But both of us, I was told
You were the road, I was the railroad afterward.
I think I was St. John the Baptist. And
That's right. Oh, no, I'm not going there. I'm not going there. I know what happened, that story.
In any case, this was the middle of January. And there were 6 of these performances, and they showed up. And it occurred to me at the last couple of sessions, these people will all go home. They'll either turn on Fox News or they'll turn on public radio. They'll be reinforced in their own ideas. When they sit here, they have to listen to each other. They have to see they're not talking to the enemy, mm-hmm. and we have a conversation. So I think the challenge is you can't meet everybody face to face, but we have to infuse back into the culture that it is appropriate to have public discussions where people disagree and they have a sharing of ideas. If we just turn on our separate television channels, it ain't going to happen.
Mm-mm.
How do you, this is a question that strikes the very heart of what I used to do, and I'm very concerned about this whole notion of fostering civil discussion of sometimes nasty questions. How do you do that, Joe?
I modeled myself on a guy who used to work for NPR. I think his name is Gary Eichten. You were a master of that, and I think that you really we commend you for that. I don't know whether your successors are as successful, because you never saw yourself as an adversary, or never saw yourself as a gotcha guy. I'm going to get you. And I think that's where you have to start with the folks in the media, recognizing their challenge is to elicit comments and conversation, not to catch people at making mistakes.
Lewis, what do you think?
Well, I was trying to think of an answer while you were talking, but I keep coming back to an email note I got at the end of last semester from a student. And the student wrote to me and said, thanks for the way that you covered the economic policy of the 1970s and 1980s. I've never actually heard anybody talk about it without saying Reagan was full of it or Reagan was a genius. And my reaction to that was, first of all, thanks, that's very nice, but also how sad that is. That isn't the way we should be conducting public discourse. And so what I want to try to do, it really made me think about my teaching. I'm not teaching economics this semester, unfortunately, but I will be back there next year, that I want students to have that kind of perspective of understanding what happened and why, but without the vitriol and without the he's right, she's wrong, she's right, he's wrong kind of attitude. And conversation is the word that keeps coming back to me. Having a civil conversation and trying to pull together some way to do that. I wish I knew how. That's one of the things that I'd like to do in the next year or two as the Farry professor, would be to convene some conversations like that.
We don't have a lot of time left, but I wanted to allow some time, time for you folks to ask these gentlemen questions. So raise your hand if you've got one. But before we get started, could I ask Joe one more question here, a quick one?
No.
No.
Professor Farry, there's a blizzard outside. It's been unpleasant this winter. You came here from California. You're a
From Los Angeles,
An
nonetheless.
otherwise brilliant man. What in the world were you thinking?
I was a graduate student actually at the time in New York, Fordham. I was getting married in 2 months, and I didn't have a job. And I got a letter from this college in Minnesota that said, how would you like to come for a 1-year replacement position? I took it. And not being very creative, I stayed.
And
Awfully
thank
glad
the
you
Lord
did.
you did. By
Hey,
the way.
before Jim Reed leaves, he should be recognized as the
The
predecessor-
initial, I forgot to do that.
He's
The first
really
Farry chair.
engaged. He is really engaged in civic
Yes.
right now. Right.
Yes.
Yes.
Congratulations to the first holder. I forgot. Thank you.
I'm running off because I have to do more of it.
You have to go be civically engaged.
Right. Be nice to the Republicans now. You've got a question. Go ahead.
Professor Johnston, directly towards you. Could you talk at all about the demographics of the railroad, whether it be in terms of the ethnicity or religion, especially when you look at the workers?
Oh, it was,
Demographics of the railroad, especially in regards to workers.
yeah, I mean, it was an amazing amalgam of people who both were already here. So, for example, Irish immigrants who had come in the 1840s tended to move west with the railroad and continue to work, but then drawing new immigrants from all across Europe to work as the railroad went west. And then the story that I think is far too undertold but needs to be talked about a lot is the fact that we also had tremendous immigration from China and Japan to build the railroad from the Pacific coast inward. That's a part of the story that doesn't get talked about a lot, because those people not only did backbreaking, difficult work like any other railroad worker, but it was dangerous in a way that people coming from the east and going west didn't have to deal with. For example, blasting tunnels through the Sierra Nevada, not even using dynamite, using black powder, and basically drilling holes with hand drills, putting the black powder in, and then being about 10 feet away when it blasted. I mean, it was just incredible that anyone would do this. They not only did it, they did it day after day, week after week, month after month, and built those things basically with their bare hands. So that's a short answer to a very deep question.
Yes, sir.
Looking at kind of the, back in the 1950s, we built the interstate road system, like you said. They saw national defense on it, and everybody got behind it because it was the Cold War. Exactly. It was national defense. What can we do to bypass some of this gridlock? And the big thing in the last year has been like the Keystone XL pipeline and things like that. What can we do? How can we encourage our public leaders to get past this bipartisan, this gridlock, and do these things that are good for the economic future of our country? So we look back in 50 years and say that was the interstate highway system of 2000 teens.
I'm only smiling because Ed had me in class, and one response to this would be to say, well, if I knew the answer, I wouldn't be here, right? But it's a really important question, and I'm coming to the conclusion that part of it, a big part of it, is something that I think you just said, Joe, that you don't see the person that you disagree with as your enemy. You might be adversaries, you might disagree, but to get out of that mindset is the critical first step. That we agree that there's a problem that needs to be solved. I may not like the way you want to approach it at first, and you may not like the way I want to approach it at first, but let's at least agree that there is something. So I think XL is a great example of that. One of the things that I've been reading about lately is that one whole group is getting very entrenched with, we've got to build this, because it's going to connect the Canadian tar sands with the refineries on the Gulf Coast. And it'll create all these jobs. And there's another group that's really, really entrenched that says, oh my God, it's going to cause global warming to accelerate and all this stuff. Let's actually narrow the problem down a little bit and ask, okay, first of all, should we be building a pipeline that connects Canada with the Gulf Coast, and maybe put our resources into connecting the Bakken with other places? Let's get out of that box of having to build it there. And then secondly, let's ask some other questions about, well, if we don't build this pipeline, Will that really affect global warming? Well, no, they're going to pump that oil out regardless of whether they build the XL or not. It's still going to bear. So we need to change the question. So I know that's a rambling answer to your question, but I think getting off the dime and asking what is the problem is the first step, and agreeing that there is one rather than just going at each other right off the bat.
Joe?
I would just add this little caution, and that is, I'm not sure the interstate highway system was built with such equanimity. Almost all these projects at the time are deeply contested political issues. You talk about, you were very kind to say I helped discuss how the power line should go through there. I wasn't discussing, I was advocating. There was a public debate about this, and there's always going to be that. Dan Whalen should come up here and talk about the challenge of how do you do public projects, because you're going to have people who are going to disagree with you. And there's just sometimes no way to get around that. Some of the things we look back on as great step forward for humanity, if you look at the process through which it went through, you're looking at make sausage, and you don't want to look too closely. The bad guys may have won, the outcome may have been good, and you don't know that. So we live always in uncertainty, and you just have to step forward and take a crack at it. It's when I think when the challenge gets so overwhelming that people in desperation will say, let's do something, and then you got a chance. If as long as you can weasel, you're not going to get that kind of, damn the torpedoes, let's do something.
Yes, sir.
Very quick things first. One, most people maybe don't know that SPRINT is actually an acronym for Southern Pacific Railroad International, which raises some interesting examples of what you're talking about. And secondly, as a Gustavus fellow, we're quite proud of the fact that James J. Hill said, give me enough sweet and enough whiskey and I can build a railroad.
I'll build a railroad, yep.
But on that, about building railroads, I'd like to hear your thoughts about moving into the future. Because what's happening, obviously, with oil issues in North Dakota and so on, is a dramatic increase in railroad traffic. We've got the North Star issue still hanging out there. People are talking about high-speed rail to Chicago on and off and more in the country. And, of course, we have dramatic increase in light rail focus in the Twin Cities, where Obama was today, who thoughtlessly interfered with Dan getting here. And that's, of course, as you say, the big battle in Minneapolis part 3 of it. So what are your thoughts about the future of railroad in Minnesota and beyond?
Let me give you one that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and this may be really strange, but I'd really like to hear especially what you think, Joe, and Jill, because this is by your house. We have a program called Rails to Trails that has part of creating the Lake Wobegon Trail that goes all along through Albany, Avon, all the way out to Sauk Center, potentially gets connected all the way to St. Cloud. There are rail to trails all over the Twin Cities. One of the things that I think is going to be a contentious issue in the next 5 years is the way that legislation was written is those are basically railroads that have been put in the bank. And the railroads have the right to run tracks on them again whenever they want to. If I was Burlington Northern Santa Fe, BNSF, I would be looking at that trail out there and saying, you know, I could have a dedicated oil railroad hauling oil from the Bakken to Chicago nonstop, basically a conveyor belt running on that thing. I'm going to go to Stearns County and say, sorry, but there's no more Lake Wobegon Trail. And that's happening for the Southwest Light Rail in the Twin Cities. That was the original Minneapolis and St. Louis Railroad, and now, you know, it's all contentious about should it stay a trail, should it have light rail, should it have freight. That's going to become a problem over the next 5 years because that's happening all over the country. That issue of taking trails and turning them back into rails is going to be on the plate of probably every mayor that's got that potential problem on it.
And I think that's illustrated in Wisconsin, where deserted railroad lines have been brought back into business to haul gravel for fracking.
Yep, frac sand.
So as long as it's a railroad right-of-way, it still belongs to the railroad. And we don't have Representative Oberstar in Congress to protect
true.
rail to trail, because he was the major advocate of that.
One more. Go ahead.
I'm going to move us from rails to roads.
Yeah.
And we talked about how there's a lack of resources for building new roads. But should the solution be using the roads we have more efficiently in terms of public transportation or, encouraging less single driver cars or things like that? What's the reality of moving to more efficient driving?
Well, the question is, just to make sure everybody heard it, that, instead of building more roads, maybe we should use what we've got more efficiently. There's an economist who, if you're interested in this, I think you should do a Google search. His name is Clifford Winston. He's written a really interesting book that makes exactly that argument. He says, look, we've got enough roads in terms of road beds and right-of-ways and stuff. We just need to use it correctly, and that means, like you said about using public transportation, things like that. It also means pricing it correctly. That if you really want to drive at 4:30 in the afternoon in a rush hour, you should have to pay more than someone who's willing to drive at 2 in the afternoon. And that you should price these kinds of services accordingly so that you use that stuff more efficiently. I think there's a lot of merit to that. London has instituted their the congestion pricing, and the fact that you can't drive into London for free anymore. You have to pay a fee if you're going to go a certain distance in, and the farther in you go towards the city of London, the more you pay. Mayor Bloomberg wanted to do that in New York, but he got shot down about that pretty fast. But I think there's no way to avoid that. I think that's coming. It's going to happen.
Joe Farry?
Ken Jones had a question.
Oh, okay, one more. Go ahead. Go ahead.
We said a minute ago that the big problem, or at least I think the less big problem, was our lack of communication with each other and our unwillingness to bend. And I wanted to see if
It's your unwillingness to bend, not mine.
I wanted to see if I could complicate that a little bit. Louis, you're talking about sewer infrastructure, which I think is wonderful because it's something that I bring up at the end of my classes every time, and students play. You're also talking about fiber optics, which, it seems to me, both of those are things which in a lot of ways are invisible, that people don't care about unless they don't have them. I don't give a darn about outstate areas that don't have fiber optics because I have it. It's not my problem. The same thing with my sewer. Unless it crumbles, I don't care. Interstate highway system is not a good parallel piece because it is
See it.
in the face of everybody. Everybody wants it. Everybody benefits. For those of you who are too young and don't understand, imagine driving from Minneapolis to Fargo and going through every little town like St. Joe. You would have come down Minnesota Street. You would have come down to the corner where Martini's is. You would have turned right. You would have gone up past the 8 plexes and rejoined the road outside of town. Can you imagine driving that with trucks, with cars, everybody going on a Friday afternoon to the lake? You want interstate highways, and you're willing to pay, and the way they were funded was through a gas tax, which is largely invisible because you don't see it in the same way that you see your income tax bill at the end of the year. People get angry at income taxes because they see it in a lump sum. If it's a small piece coming out all the time, you don't see it in the same way. So I don't see that as a parallel piece. So I think, how do we find a model that moves us in these invisible areas when we don't have the Cold War and we don't have this pent-up consumer demand? You were talking about the 1924 Highway Act. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
It's not the federal government, in my view, being clever.
No.
It's meeting consumer demand.
Yeah. Well, here's a history senior thesis, if anybody wants to write it, or a political science one. This would be a really good one. In the 1955 Minnesota in the Minnesota legislature, they created a fund so that every city in Minnesota could create sanitary sewer systems. You could borrow from the fund if you were of a certain income level, or you could get a grant from the fund if you had a certain amount of poverty in your city, or if you had a certain level of economic development. How did they do that? It'd be really interesting to do a case study and find out what happened there. Speaking of Gustavus, I taught at Gustavus for 4 years, and a colleague there, when I put that question to him, who had gone through some of that as a legislator, he said, well, it's easy because we didn't have partisan designation. We didn't have Democrats and Republicans in the legislature. We had a conservative caucus and a liberal caucus, but we did not have party designation, and that made all the difference when we tried to negotiate those things. Maybe that's it, but heck, there's a study that we could do.
Joe?
I'm going to forget the name of this, but you might remember, Gary, because NPR has been a beneficiary of this sales tax that was
The legacy fund.
Yeah.
And how did that get passed? In no more than 10 years ago, right?
Well, everybody likes clean water, and it was kind of sold on that base. And, you know,
Ducks.
the great outdoors and ducks and stuff,
So,
And the arts.
so you build a broad enough coalition, and you get around partisanship. Yeah. I think we have to rely more and more on public interest group kind of pressures in our society. Our political system, unfortunately, is going in that direction. And the challenge is, of course, people with big, deep pockets can come up and put down on the table a bunch of money that'll equal the influence of a well-organized citizens group. So that's the new reality. But, you know, democracy has never been an easy process. It's always responding to new challenges, and some creative person's going to figure out, especially using modern social media, how to build that kind of network so that those stack of dollars over here aren't going to be as influential as they seem to be now.
Do you miss being in the classroom?
Ask Jill.
I have a variant on that question. Do you miss grading?
No. In fact, I want to say something. The most important thing I ever did in my life was to find a really, really fine person to marry. And what people don't recognize is that being married to somebody who's in the teaching business is not an easy task. We are always calling up and saying, gee, I'm going to be late. Some student just dropped in my office. Or the meeting ran longer. Or getting up from the Christmas dinner and going to the room to correct the final exams. Those are not pleasant activities. And I've been blessed. I should also mention that Jill also spent a number of years on these two campuses, and she actually gets more Christmas cards from former students than I do.
I got one last one for you, Lewis. 2.5 years from now, how are you going to judge whether you did what you wanted to do as the Lewis Farry?
If I've been able to advance the conversation and start people talking about things that they weren't talking about before, that's going to be the first bar that I set for myself. The second one is I'm going to probably turn to you and to Joe and to Matt and to Dan and ask, is this going the way you wanted it to? And if you guys say yes, then I'll be satisfied.
Two really distinguished folks here. Little round of applause. Joseph Farry, Lewis Johnston.
Thank you, Greg.